Hey friends, welcome back to Apologetics. Super pumped to join us today to have Joe Schmid from the Majesty of Reason. We're going to be talking about his recent article on causal finitism. So Joe, what's up, man? How you doing?
I'm doing well. I've enjoyed the times that I've come on your channel, and I'm really looking forward to this one. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious. And one really hard question is red your favorite color? Because I was just looking at your background. I'm like, there's so much red happening over there.
Yeah, so I don't really have a favorite color, to be honest. I mean, my favorite soccer team is Arsenal, and so they're the colored red, right? That's their home color. So, you got am I pointing the right direction? Oh yeah, so we got the scarf, we got the Arsenal fan parking only. I've got all Arsenal stuff behind me. So,
Mhm. But it's like your book, there's a bunch of red popping out, and there's another big book behind you
yeah,
that's like red with all these words. And I'm like, well, maybe red is your favorite color. So who knows?
maybe it's a subconscious sort of thing.
We're discovering truth here together. Besides, we're talking about red. We're gonna be talking about like Joe's article on causal finitism. So, Joe, to get things started, do you want to talk a little bit like preliminary notes, like of what's going on in this article and this discussion that we're gonna be having?
Yeah, so I'm guessing you're gonna put it in the description, so if people want to read it, they can check it out. It's also
Mhm.
on my Phil People profile as well as my website, josephschmid.com. But yeah, it's called A Step-by-Step Argument for Causal Finitism. I develop a kind of abductive slash inductive, non-deductive argument for causal finitism, a very tentative one in the article. And it published with Air Kentness, that's a journal, philosophy journal. And so yeah, what are some preliminary notes on this? Well, firstly, I want to say before we get in is that this article is exploratory, right? So I kind of just wanted to see how far I could push these new sorts of arguments because I developed like new arguments in it. And I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm not entirely sure whether my arguments succeed. I at least find them really philosophically interesting, and I think that they can lay the foundation for new research in debates concerning causal finitism. And I'll be noting occasionally some of my reservations as we proceed. So that's kind of the first preliminary note. It's like this article was mainly exploratory on my end. I'm not really trying to stake a flag and defend a particular position. I really want to explore these arguments. And then the second preliminary note is that all things considered, I'm about agnostic on the truth of causal finitism. And we're going to get into what causal finitism is later. But so what that means is just basically I suspend judgment on whether or not causal finitism is true. And I'll explain later on in this discussion why that is.
I really like your mentality, Joe, and thinking about these things because, like, I'm not gonna be like a full-on like philosopher or anything like that one day. It's not in the horizon for me. But like, I totally agree with like the way you're doing things, and I think like we can all do the same thing where we can defend certain views to like explore it and think about it without like being like explicitly committed to it. Because I think sometimes, like when I first got into this whole like philosophy apologetic sphere, it's like, oh, if you produce a video or have someone on defending a view, that's your view. You can't have like the other guys on. Ooh, that's not good.
Yeah.
That's mean. So I really like what you're doing there.
Yeah, no, and I want to reiterate that, like, I guess reciprocate that. I love that about your channel, right? You're getting open theists on, you're getting Molinists on, you're getting theological determinists on, and so on. Like, it's in the process of, it's for the purpose of exploration and serving people. So,
Exactly. So to dive right into your paper then, Joe, what is causal finitism?
yeah, so causal finitism, which is the central centerpiece of my article, is basically it's a thesis, right? So it's a metaphysical thesis about the way that reality is. And there are a number of slightly different ways that you can say it, but I guess the simple way to say it is that infinite causal regresses are impossible. There cannot be infinite causal regresses. What is a causal regress? Well, it's just where A is caused by B, which is in turn caused by C, which is in turn caused by D, and so on ad infinitum. So basically, nothing can have infinitely many causes, whether directly or indirectly. Not necessarily every causal history is finite. You could put it in a bunch of different ways, but that's the basic idea. Now, one quick thing before I turn it back over to you is that causal finitism not only rules out, as Alexander Proust says, causal finitism not only rules out these infinite dependence chains of causation, so infinite causal regresses, it also rules out infinite causal cooperation. So what that means is that infinitely many distinct causes might be impacting a target state. So he actually has a nice visualization, and I have his book right here, but I just want to show this visualization. If you can see that, right, the one on, I think it's the left, the one on the left is the kind of regress style, right? That's an infinite regress, causal regress. But the other one also involves infinitely many causes impacting some target state. Both of these, according to Proust, and yeah, both of these are violations of causal finitism. So causal finitism is best understood as the thesis that nothing can have infinitely many causes, really, whether directly or indirectly.
So thinking about causal finitism, thinking like if we think of like causation as like a chain of dominoes, like one causes the other, one causes another. The causal finitist is going to say like that chain of dominoes can't be infinite. There's going to be like a first domino, whereas someone who would deny causal finitism would say like, hey, at least conceptually, it's possible that like that chain of dominoes could be infinite in the past.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, they might even also say like you could have infinite concurrent causal, like infinitely many things concurrently operating at the same time to produce something, like infinitely many dominoes, let's say they get smaller and smaller and smaller, infinitely many of them knock into one domino, right? So that would be
Yeah.
infinitely many things causing one target state. That's also a violation of causal finitism.
Okay, right on. Well, getting into your paper, Joe, you talk about a couple principles to get this thing started. So you talk about like what is the step principle?
Yeah. So just a lay of the land for the audience. What I do is I first articulate some principles, just like metaphysical principles that I guess someone might find really plausible, just on the face of it. So I articulate these principles, and then I go on to evaluate certain paradoxes in light of those principles. And I basically say, in light of those principles, we can derive various contradictions from certain paradoxes. And so, given that we derived a contradiction, we must have gone wrong somewhere, right? There must have been some sort of false assumption that allowed us to get to the contradiction, right? And then I basically investigate later on in my article, well, what's the culprit, right? What's the false assumption? And I basically give a kind of inference to the best explanation that the culprit is probably infinite causal regresses. So basically the denial of causal finitism. So that's the lay of the land. So firstly, yeah, like you said, I go into these different principles. And we're going to use these principles as we talk about paradoxes later on. So these are important for the audience, these principles. The first one, like you asked, was the step principle. And I want to be very precise here, so I will read it as I said in the article. So the step principle, or SP, is a conditional. So it says if A, then B, basically, like if such and such, then such and such. So here's the principle. If, one, each of the steps in two processes result in identical states of the process's respective systems. Two, the cardinalities of the steps in the two processes are the same. And three, the process's respective systems are explanatorily closed. Then the states of the two systems are identical at the end of the two processes. Okay, let me step back. I'm going to reiterate that firstly. And then secondly, we're just going to basically, spell it out. What is the saying? So the step principle is saying if these three conditions hold, then such and such follows. So the three conditions are: one, each of the steps in two processes result in identical states of the process's respective systems. That's the first condition. The second condition is that the cardinalities of the steps in the two processes are the same. So that's the number of steps involved. Let's say 10 or 20 or infinitely many. They're the exact same for both processes. And the third condition is that the process's respective systems are explanatorily closed. And I'll explain what that is later. Then it follows that the states of the two systems are identical at the end of the two processes. So what is an explanatorily closed system? Well, it's basically a system where, what a system is like a bounded area of sorts, right? So it's kind of like a conceptually primitive thing. So like this room here would be like a system, or an urn, like what an urn contains. We could treat that as a system, or things like that. So an explanatorily closed system is a system which has no causal or explanatory factors outside of the system influencing the state or condition of that system.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically, explanatorily closed systems are ones where the end state of the system after a given period of time depends only on the various actions and operations within that system itself and within the various processes and happenings and phenomena within that system, right? Because it's explanatorily closed. There's nothing outside of it that's influencing it. So its end state is purely a function of what happens within it, basically, over time. So let's get an example on the table to try to understand SP. So basically, suppose we have two people, Smith and Jones, okay? And they're going to begin a process. So, which is just, I take a process to be like a series of steps, like a process could be brushing your teeth, like first you do this motion, then you get the back molars, and then the back molars, and then, etc. So that's like a process. It's a series of steps. So they're doing these, Smith and Jones, they're undergoing these processes, and they're doing it stepwise. And this process is one of traveling from Las Vegas to New York, okay? Now, they each follow a different procedure in their processes. Again, it's a step-by-step process. So here is how Jones does it. So Jones, firstly, drives from Vegas to Dallas. Secondly, he flies from Dallas to Albany, New York. And then thirdly, he drives from Albany to New York, Okay, so that's Jones. That's what he does. Those are his steps in his process. What about Smith? Well, here's Smith's process. Smith, firstly, flies from Vegas to Dallas. The second step in Smith's process is to drive from Dallas to Albany, New York. And then the third step in the process is to fly from Albany, New York to New York City. So notice that like the different procedures implemented for each step in these processes aren't the same, right? Jones drove from Vegas to Dallas, whereas Smith flew from Vegas to Dallas. But nevertheless, the end state of each step is identical, right? In the first step, they both end up in Dallas, right? In the second step, they both end up in Albany. And in the third step, they both end up in New York City. And so while they undergo different procedures for the various steps, like they get to the end state of the individual steps, nevertheless, they still get to the same end state. And what I want to say is that given that they perform the same number of steps, and given that each step that they perform ends in the exact same end state, right?
Mhm.
It's going to follow that they can't diverge in the end state of their overall process, right? And that seems really intuitive. Yeah, they both end up in New York, right? That seems obvious, right? Precisely because each step along the way is such that there was no difference between where they ended up, right? Their states were basically identical. They were in the same location. So there's just no way that they could diverge. There's no way that they could somehow end up at a different location at the end. And so that's basically the idea behind SP. It's like if you have two processes and they have the same number of steps, and the end state of each of those individual steps is the exact same for both of the processes, then the end state of the processes as a whole is going to be different, right? How else could you get a different end state, right? If the process is just a function of what goes on, if the end state of the process is just a function of what goes on within the system, right? Because it's an explanatorily closed system. And if you have the exact same number of steps between the two processes, and moreover, the steps end in the exact same end state for each individual step along the way, it just seems so clear that they're going to end in the like the whole process is going to be ending. They're both the processes are going to end in the exact same end state, basically. So yeah, that's the basic idea behind it. And yeah.
Do you have a good way of like thinking about how like to summarize this principle, Joe, to kind of explain to people that are like maybe have never heard this before?
Yeah, so basically, if we have two people, well, I don't know if I want to use people, but just a summary is if you have two different processes, two different undertakings, each of which is a kind of step-by-step process,
Mhm.
and if they're the same number of steps, and if the steps end in the exact same state of the system in each case, then at the very end of the entire processes, the system is going to look identical. That's the basic idea.
Okay, yeah, I think there's something intuitive to that. It's like looking at it from afar. You see like two lines pointing to the same spot, just spitballing here, and it's like, well, if those lines are pointing to the same spot, then they're similar lines, I guess you could say. I'm trying to think exactly how
Yeah,
to
or
think
I
out loud
mean,
with
if
this.
you could almost take it individual, like incrementally, like if each point on the line is such that it's at the exact same coordinate, right? So each
Mhm.
point along the way is at the exact same coordinate. That's like the end state of it. And so it's identical. The state of the system is identical for each of the respective lines. Uh, if each point along the way is the exact same, well, then it's going to be the same at the end, right? You're going to have the same
Mhm.
endpoint to the process. So yeah, we're thinking of a line segment, let's say. So yeah, that's the basic idea.
Okay, that's great. So then what's the ineffective principle, Joe?
Yeah, so this is yet another principle. And then yeah, so the ineffective principle or IP is basically saying that adding any number of interactions with a system doesn't affect the state or condition of the system if none of the aforementioned interactions changes the state or condition of the system. I mean, that just sounds so obvious when I say it. Like, let me say this again. Like, listen, adding any number of interactions with a system does not affect the state or condition of the system if none of the aforementioned interactions changes the state of the system. That
Mm.
seems so obvious. I mean, come on, like you're literally like if you're adding some sort of interaction with a system, and let's say it causes it to go from like A but back to it goes from A to B but back to A, right? So like if I do that little interaction, it goes from A to B back to A. Well, then no matter how many times I do that, right? It doesn't matter. The system is going to end up still in that A, right? Because each time I did those interactions, it didn't alter the state of the system. It went at the beginning of my interaction at A, but my interaction, remember, didn't affect the state or condition of the system. It went right back to A. So, yeah, it's going to still be an A at the end of doing that interaction. And it doesn't matter how many number of interactions you do. You could do 3 of those, right? A to B to A, A to B to A, A to B to A. It's still going to end in A. You could do infinitely many, and it's still going to end in A, basically.
Okay, that's great. So then the last principle we're going to talk about, Joe, is like, what is the removal and effectiveness principle?
Yeah, the removal ineffectiveness principle says, so sorry for the audience. This is going to be the most grueling part of the video, but if you can get through this, we're getting to the fun paradoxes later on. So the removal ineffectiveness principle, or RIP, R-I-P, says that were any number of interactions with a system let me start over. It says that were any number of interactions with a system performed before some time t, none of which changed the system's state to be performed, well, then the state of the system at t in the resulting world would be identical to the state of the system at t in the actual world. Okay, let me restate that. Were any number of interactions with a system performed before some time t, none of which changed the system's state to be removed. So if we are removing any number of these interactions with the system, none of which changed the system's state, it doesn't matter how many we're removing. The resulting world, where after we did the removal, the state of the system at t is going to be the exact same as in the actual world. So again, we have these various interactions which aren't changing the state of the system. So return to the case where you go from point A to point B back to point A. So basically, if we removed some of those interactions, right, maybe one of them going from A to B to A, well, then the resulting state is going to be, if we remove that and we go to a world in which that's removed, the resulting state is going to be the exact same as it is in the actual world, because that little interaction that I performed, remember, it didn't change the state of the system. It went from taking it originally from A, then to B, then back to A, and it didn't change the state of the system. So if you're removing it, then it's also that's not going to change the state of the system. So, because it started in A, and if you performed it and it went back to A, so if you had never performed that, right, it would have still stayed in A. That's basically the idea. And remember, this is an explanatorily closed system, so nothing outside of the system is going to cause it to go from A to B or anything else like that. So, and it doesn't matter how many number of these you perform. Like if you did 4 of these A to B to A's, like so A to B to A, A to B to A, A to B to A, etc., it doesn't matter how many of those you remove. If you remove 4, 5, infinitely many, it's still going to be the exact same as it was in the actual world that when we didn't do such removals. So again, these are tricky and it's hard to explain, and it's quite technical in the paper, but I hope that helps.
I'm curious then, Joe. So we have these 3 principles that we talked about: the step principle, the ineffective principle, and the removal and effectiveness principle. For someone wondering, like, what was the point of the last 15 minutes? Why are we going through these principles? What impact is this going to have as we look at the rest of this video and we dive into these paradoxes?
Yeah, so basically I use these principles in developing these sorts of new paradoxes. They're, I guess, new variants of old paradoxes, and I bring in these principles and say you can get contradictions from these old paradoxes if you bring in these really plausible principles. I mean, again, because they're so complicated, you might not see how plausible they are, but if you go through my article and you see their formulations and my explications of my explanations, at least the people that I've talked to have found them really plausible. So I mean, I find them plausible as well. Just on the face of it, at least. So yeah, we have these plausible principles, and if you combine them with these paradoxes and you get contradictions, well, that means we must have gone wrong somewhere. There must have been some sort of falsity, right? Because we got a contradiction from a set of assumptions. So at least one of those assumptions must be false. Now, I argue, again, that all these principles are really plausible, so we shouldn't throw out those. So what should we throw out? Well, and later on, I go through the different potential culprits of what's engendering the paradox, and I say that each of these paradoxes involve infinite causal chains, and that's arguably the best culprit. That's basically the idea of the article. So do you want me to get into the Littlewood Ross paradox now?
Yeah, let's do it. Sounds great.
Okay, so this is the first paradox in my article, and I don't think we're going to go through absolutely every single one of them, but I'll just give you the basics for the Littlewood Ross and then the Thompson's lamp. So the Littlewood Ross paradox, how should I explain? Okay, so let's just imagine we have an infinitely large urn. Okay, so an urn is basically like a big container, for those of you who don't know. It's a giant urn. It's infinitely large, in fact. And imagine that it has infinitely many numbered balls. No, imagine that we have infinitely many numbered balls, right? So they're like little ping pong balls, basically, imagine. And you can have like number 1, number 2, number 3, different balls. They're each labeled with a unique natural number on them. So the urn is originally empty. Okay. Secondly, the urn and the balls persist in existence unless something comes along to positively destroy them. And so these are just stipulations that I'm making for my little paradox. The urn and the balls persist in existence unless something comes along to positively destroy them. There are no destructive factors operative on them at or before noon. So we're considering sometime noon. And moreover, nothing affects the urn at noon, right? No action is like inputting balls at noon, removing balls at noon, and so on. And then fourthly, the content of the urn, that is like the number of balls that it contains, the labels on the balls, and so on, that persists as it is unless it's positively changed by some action that I'm going to specify in the process. And then finally, the only manipulations that are going to alter the state of this urn are manipulations of the balls that I'm going to be specifying in a certain process. And this process is going to be a step-by-step process. This is where the step principle is going to be pretty big. Okay, so we've got this big urn. We've got all the balls, right? Infinitely many balls. We've got an infinitely big urn. And we got all these stipulations just about the logistics of the scenario. And now I'm going to give you two different processes that are going to be performed on the balls in the urn. So the first process we can call process 1. So basically, what you're doing with process 1 is you're putting in balls numbered. Okay, how should I do this? Because I get mathematical in the article. I guess what I could say is that you're putting in balls 1 through 10 at the first step of this first process. And then the second step of this process, you put 11 through 20. The third step, you're putting in 21 through 30. The fourth step, you're putting in 31 through 40, and so on ad infinitum, right? So we're basically doing what philosophers call a super task. So we can perform the first step at, let's say, 11:30. We can perform the next step at 11:45, the next step at 11:52, 30 seconds, and so on, getting closer and closer and closer to noon, right? So we are performing infinitely many of these steps before noon. And remember, this is the first process, process 1. What we're doing is the first step we're just putting in balls 1 to 10. That's the first step. The second step in this process, balls 11 to 20, and so on ad infinitum. That's the first process. Now let's consider the second process. Oh, wait, does my first one involve removing numbers? Sorry, I'm just trying to remember. Let me pick it up. Yeah, okay. So I forgot a crucial element in this first one. What you want to do is remove ball number 1 in the first procedure. So the first step. So the first step, you put all the 10 balls in, 1 through 10, and then you remove ball number 1. Okay, that's what you do for the first step. And then the second step, you put in balls 11 through 20, and you remove ball number 2. And then the third step, you put in 21 through 30, and you remove ball number 3, right? And so on ad infinitum, right? So that is what you're doing at each step in this process. So again, you're putting in these balls 1 through 10, these 10 balls, and then you're taking out number 1 at the first step, and then the second step, and you do this stepwise infinitely many times before noon. Okay, that's process 1. Now for process 2. So for process 2, you put in balls. So it's the same timing, right? So you perform the same number of steps. This is an explanatorily closed system. It's the same urn. It's the same balls, everything, the same stipulations. But your process is different. Your process instead, the steps are, here's what you're doing in the first step. You're putting in balls 1 through 9. And then you write on the ball number 1, you write a 0 next to it to make it 10. So effectively what you did is you put in balls 1 through 9, and then you changed ball 1 to ball 10. Okay, so now at the end of the first step, you have balls 2 through 10 in there. And if you notice something, right, that's the same as in the first process, right? Remember, in the first process, you put in balls 1 through 10, and you just took out 1. So what you're left with is 2 through 10. In this second process, right, the first step is you're putting in balls 1 through 9, and then you write a 0 to the right of the 1 to make it such that you have balls 2 through 10. It's the same end state. So that's the first step in this second process. The second step in this second process is put balls 11 through 19, and then take ball number 2 and write a 0 next to it. That makes it number 20. So now you have balls, 3 through 20 in there, which is the same as you had in the first process, if you think about it. And so basically you repeat this. You repeat this. You put in basically the 11 through 19, and then you write a 0 on the 2. That's the second step. The third step is you put in balls 21 through 29, and then you take the 3 and you write a little 0 next to it to make that ball 30, and so on ad infinitum. And so let's think about this, right? Think about what is going to be the end state of that first process. Well, you're going to have no balls left in the urn at the end of that first process. Why is that? Well, because on each step, you took out the ball with the natural number of that step, right? So on the first step, you took out the ball number 1 and you never put it back in. In the second step, you took out ball number 2 and you never put it back in. In the third step, you took out ball number 3 and you never put it back in. And so on ad infinitum. So there cannot be any balls left in the urn at the end of this process, right? Think about it. If there were a ball left in the urn at the end of this process, what would its number be? Could it be like 4,000? No, because on the 4,000th step, you took out that ball and you never put it back in, right? So there can't be any balls left in the urn at the end of this first process 1. But now think about process 2. Process 2 does not end. Process 2, at the end of the process at noon, right? So we're comparing the states of the systems at noon. At the end of that second process, it's full of the urn is full of infinitely many balls, right? You never removed any balls whatsoever in this process, right? Remember, you just added in 1 through 9, and then you just wrote a little 0 on the 1 to make it a 10. So you literally just added in 9 balls. And you did that every single step. You just added 9 balls, then you added 9 balls, and then you added 9 balls, and you added 9 balls. To be sure, you like wrote some numbers on them, but you never took anything out, right? So at the end of this process, you're going to have infinitely many balls. You're going to have 9 in the first step, 9 in the second step, 9, 9, 9, 9, 9, 9, all that for infinitely many steps. You have infinitely many balls in the urn after this second process. But just think about this, right? Like at the end of each step in this process, the state of the urns were identical. They were identical. At the end of the first step, the state of the urns, it was balls 2 through 10, right? Because in the first step, remember, you put in 1 through 10 and you took out 1. And then the second step, you put in 1 through 9, and you wrote a little 0 on the 1 to make it a 10. So you have 2 through 10. In the next one, right, you have, 2 through 20? Or maybe was it 3 through 20 or whatever? Yeah, you have 3 through 20 in the second step for both of them. In the third step, you have 4 through 30. And so on, right? You have the exact same balls in the content in the urn after each step of both of these processes. And yet somehow at the end of the processes, you get radically divergent results, right? In one of them, it's a full urn, and in the other, it's an empty urn. That, I mean, if you think about this carefully, that's a violation of SP. Remember, SP said if you have 2 different processes in a system, and each of the individual steps in the processes has an end state which is identical, and there's the same number of steps in these processes, and if it's an explanatorily closed system, which I stipulated, it follows that the end state of the process as a whole has to be the same. But we just concluded that the end state of the process as a whole is not the same. So we have a violation of SP on our hands. That's the paradoxical nature of this. The paradoxical nature of this is that SP seems really intuitively plausible, and yet you get a violation of it if you do this infinite causally connected process. So that's the basic idea.
Do you want to talk about Thompson's lamp, or do you want to talk about some of your paradoxes, Joe, that you developed that kind of like build upon these ideas?
So, for purposes of space, I think people, if they're interested in Thompson's lamp, and that's where the toggle principle and the ineffectiveness principle and those sorts of things come in, and the RIP, the removal ineffectiveness principle, those come in with Thompson's lamp. So we for purposes of space, I'm kind of with you. We don't need to get into those. If people are interested, they can check the article. I developed some new paradoxes concerning Thompson's lamp. I guess I'll just basically I'll just say what Thompson's lamp is so we don't leave the audience hanging. Thompson's lamp, you basically have, you're asking what is the state of the lamp at noon? And then before noon, there are infinitely many togglings of the switch. So you turn the switch on and then it goes off, and then it goes on and then it goes off. And you do this faster and faster and faster, right? So at 11:30, it's on. At 11:45, you toggle it off. At 11:52:30, you toggle it back on, and so on ad infinitum, up and up and up until noon. And you then ask, like, well, is it on or is it off? Is the lamp on or off at noon, right? It can't be on, since anytime you turn it on, you subsequently turn it off, right? But it also can't be off, since every time you turned it off, you almost immediately turn it back on. So actually, strictly speaking, you can't get a contradiction out of this setup that I just gave. You have to add, as I point out in the article, you have to add certain principles like the removal and effectiveness principle and so on. So yeah, anyway, that's the basic idea behind Thompson's lamp. It's a little bit paradox, and it's another paradox involving infinity and so on. But yeah, now let's get on to these like different variants that I developed. So this is where a lot of the novelty comes in my article. So Thompson's lamp, that's not mine, right? That's from Thompson. And then the Littlewood Ross paradox that comes from mathematicians like Littlewood and Ross, right? So those paradoxes aren't mine. I mean, applying these various principles to these paradoxes, that is new. But also I develop new variants of the paradoxes. So what's the purpose of these variants? Well, the variants basically alter minor details within the scenario, which show that the paradox, the contradiction, isn't due to certain, specific features of a given particular specification of a particular scenario. So in one of them, so in my paradox that I specified, right, it was a super task, if you remember, right? You performed infinitely many tasks in a finite period of time. What that means is that you're performing tasks faster and faster and faster. Of course, a human couldn't do this, but you might be able to imagine like some sort of angel or god that was able to do this, or some sort of machine that was able to do this at superhuman speeds and so on. But so someone might try to resist the paradoxes and say like, oh, well, we don't have to say that there can't be infinite causal chains to debar these paradoxes, to rule these out. Maybe time just can't be structured like that, right? Maybe time just can't be broken up into these smaller and smaller units ad infinitum. Or maybe there can't be anything that is able to perform a process that fast, right? Maybe that can kill the paradox. And so you don't need to go to causal finitism, right? Because each of these involves some sort of infinite causal chain. The state of the system at the end of the process is dependent on infinitely many causal steps beforehand. So it's basically ways to resist causal finitism. I'm like, well, actually, you can develop paradoxes that don't involve the super task, or that don't involve a machine that has to go faster and faster and faster and faster and faster, right? And so I basically just give a bunch of different variations. And so I guess I'll go through one here just for purposes of space. Otherwise, we're going to be here all day. So I think I want to try the one where it's an infinite past. So let me open this up in my. If you have any comments while I'm bringing this up, I'll turn it over to you while I try to find it.
Wow, putting pressure on me. I mean, I think that at this point, I think we're at a good spot, and I'm just kind of putting filler in words. I don't know exactly what to say because I'm so flustered. So I'm just going to keep talking about random stuff until I get thoughts about, like, the weather's pretty nice here in Virginia right now. But I guess thinking about this, I think it's really cool how you're building on these paradoxes, Joe, because you're trying to it's just really cool what you're doing. And I think that when you think about these things, you're a great example to look to on how you're really, even though you don't have your mindset on causal finitism, and we're going to get into that in a minute, you're really doing the best to try to find the truth here and give people tools that they can explore on their own. So,
all right, awesome.
now?
Yeah, I pulled it up now, so thank you. Yeah, okay, so this one, you don't have to have like causal transmissions getting faster and faster and faster and faster and faster. And you also don't have to have time getting infinitely smaller and smaller and smaller, because, that is controversial. There are some philosophers who take a view of time called discrete view of time, where time has smallest units that you can't further decompose.
Yeah.
So here's one version that doesn't require that. So basically, we have the two processes, but they're performed throughout an infinite past, essentially. This one is actually this one involves, okay, yeah, so no, this one does have the faster and faster time. I'm gonna see if Proust was the one who gave the one where it has infinite time and infinite afterlife. So that one's a little bit extravagant. Okay, set aside set aside what I was saying about getting faster and faster and faster with respect to time. Because you can actually get like mathematically coherent situations wherein you have an endless afterlife, but then after that you have another endless afterlife. So it's super interesting, but that actually allows you to get these sorts of paradoxes that don't require smaller and smaller time and faster units. The one that I'm about to share with you is one where you don't have to have causal transmissions getting faster and faster and faster. So you don't have that, like, you don't have someone having to perform a task like super duper quickly, or any machine having to do that super duper quickly. I mean, after all, plausibly, some philosophers argue that causal transmissions in the actual world can't go faster than the speed of light. And if that's the case, well, then at least in the actual world, you wouldn't be able to have these paradoxes. And maybe there's some like absolute maximum for how fast causal transmissions can go, right? So that would be able to kill the paradox as well. So in order to rule that out, in order to rule out these sorts of things, I developed the following situation. So this does involve space. This does involve time getting smaller and smaller, but causal transmission it could be at the speed of light, let's say, and you don't have to have any mechanism that's like doing things faster and faster and faster. So okay, so consider a scenario wherein we have some sort of mechanism that can shoot a laser beam that can go and then cause one of the steps to be performed or something like that. Okay, so that's the mechanism, and it's like shooting some laser beam or something. It is so hard to explain because it's like mathematical and everything, but
Yeah.
yeah, so it shoots a laser beam, and that travels at the speed of light, and then that basically just affects this infinitely large urn to perform the first step of one of the processes at, let's say, 11:30. So it's the same timing as in the original paradox, but you don't have faster and faster causal transmission. So then what you have an infinite past, and then the first laser shooter or whatever sends its laser at like 1 light year, like however long it takes for it to be 1 light year away in the past or whatever. Oh my goodness. Let me just read it. So basically each mechanism is shooting out its laser, and it is n light years away from the position in the urn where it's going to, cause the balls to go into. And then at different points in the past, right? Because if each of them is a certain amount of light years away and they get farther and farther, right? That's going to take longer and longer for the light to reach it, right? So each of them is shooting their lasers at different points along the infinite past. And so basically what you're able to do is that you can get all the lasers arriving at the same times as in the original paradox, and so causing the various manipulations and so on, but you don't have faster than light causal transmission or something along those lines. So it's quite complicated, and I advise people to check out the paper. This one is hard to talk about verbally just because there's so much math involved. If people look at the paper, I mean, I'm going like 2 to the power of 1 minus n and 2 to the power of negative 1n, and I'm getting into these anyway. So that's one different variation on the paradox that avoids certain ways that people might push back against these paradoxes as used in favor of causal finitism, right? What I want to say is that you can get rid of a lot of these auxiliary assumptions, like time can't be infinitely divisible, or that time can be infinitely divisible, rather, and that causal transmission can go arbitrarily fast, and that you can have an infinite amount of matter, right? That's another assumption. And I show that you don't actually need that assumption, right? Remember, the urn was infinitely large. Some people might say you just can't have infinite amounts of mass, right? That's another way that you could kill it. But what I show is that no, I mean, you can get rid of all these auxiliaries and you're still left with a paradox, essentially. And so what that tells us is, well, plausibly, none of those particular things are responsible for the paradox. Rather, as I argue, plausibly, it's due to there being these infinite causal chains, right? It's precisely because you have an infinite causal chain that's able to lead up to this target state that you can have this step-by-step process leading to these different violations of SP. And just worrying about the structure of space and the structure of time and so on, and the structure of causal relations, what I point out is that you could just get rid of those. You could get rid of those assumptions and develop different versions of the paradox that get rid of those assumptions, but that nevertheless still have the contradiction. So what seems to be preserved in each of these cases is infinite causal chains. And so that seems to be the culprit. Okay, now I think that was a lot clearer.
Yeah, I think that was clear, and yeah, I think that's good. Joe, do you have any way of explaining this? I'm always thinking about ways to try to keep things simple. So if you had a really simple elevator pitch, 30 seconds way of summarizing what the issue is going to be here with this paradox that you're bringing up here, how would you kind of summarize that?
Yeah. So basically what we have is we have an infinite causal process being performed either in an arbitrarily short period of time or maybe infinitely long. And we have two respective processes going on. And despite the fact that they have absolutely identical end states for each of the individual steps along the way, and despite the fact that they have the exact same number of steps, and despite the fact that nothing outside the system influences the state of the system, nevertheless, you get divergent results at the end of the two processes. And that just seems crazy. And that seems crazy because we have this step principle, or SP, which seems intuitively plausible. And given that, we can say that we have a violation of SP on our hands, but SP is true, so we get a contradiction. SP is false and true. So where did we go wrong? We went wrong somewhere. One of our assumptions must have been false because we derived a contradiction. And what I argue is that the most likely culprit for the false assumption is that there can be infinite causal chains, right? There can be an infinite causal process wherein you have these step-by-step things that can occur. So that's the basic thrust.
Right on. So I'm curious then, Joe. Let's talk about this. Why do you think, at least in the paper, why would you argue that causal finitism is the best solution to all these paradoxes that we're bringing forward here?
Yeah, so a little bit was precisely because what we were just talking about for the like the different variations, right? I gave a lot of different variations in the article that show like appealing to discrete views of time or discrete views of space. Like that's not going to be able to kill it because I can get paradoxes like these same sorts of paradoxes without the assumption of infinitely divisible space or infinitely divisible time or arbitrarily fast causal relations or
Mhm.
infinitely an infinite amount of mass. None of those are essential to the paradox. I may have specified the paradox originally that way, but my point is that you can discharge those assumptions and you can get basically the exact same paradox without using those sorts of assumptions. And so what that tells us is that none of those ways that a lot of contemporary philosophers use to get around infinity paradoxes, none of those are going to work in this case. And I argue that the only plausible culprit remaining is causal finitism. So that's basically the idea. And I also appeal to something called Patrick principles. And I basically just follow Rob Kuhn's in that regard. I basically just say like, hey, a Patrick principle is a modal epistemological tool. It gives us reasons to think that certain things are possible. And it's basically like if we have actual things that are individually possible, and you can just rearrange them in certain ways, well, then the rearrangements are going to be possible, right? So I have a bunch of stacks of books right next to me. And if I, because they're individually possible, plausibly, I can like rearrange them and shuffle them around and even like duplicate them. Some of them, there being more matter, I can duplicate them and rearrange them. And then that rearrangement, I have good reason to think that that's possible. That's what the Patrick principle says. It's like if you have rearrangements of things that are known to be individually possible, then you have good reason to think that that rearrangement in which you cut and paste things and duplicate things and rearrange things, you have good reason to think that that's possible. And basically what I say is that if there could be infinite causal chains, right? So if there could be like infinitely many things which are arranged in a causal chain way that, stretch back infinitely into an infinite regress, whether within a finite period of time or an infinite period of time, you're going to be able to rearrange like actually existent mechanisms so as to be able to engender these sorts of paradoxes, so as to be able to construct by rearrangement these sorts of paradoxical scenarios. Because we know that urns are possible, we know that little balls are possible, we know that numbering balls is possible, we know that there are mechanisms that can move balls and things like that. And so if there really could be infinite causal chains, well, then I can basically rearrange actually existent things into that structure, that infinite causal structure, so that they instantiate this paradox, this Littlewood
Mhm.
Ross paradox. So those are two sorts of reasons that I go through in the article. And of course, I have some reservations for these. So I have various reservations for Patrick principles, and I have. It's not clear to me ultimately that causal finitism is the best solution. You might be able to give a kind of unsatisfiable triplet or quadruplet specification, like just because some infinite causal chains are impossible because they have contradictions, it doesn't mean that all of them are impossible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So, but I know we're going to talk more about causal finitism later, so.
Mhm. Yeah, that's great, Joe. So I'm be curious then. A lot of people might be listening to this and wondering, like, "Dang, Joe, this is pretty good. Like, why don't you just like be a full-on causal finitist, bro? Get on the train, let's go." So what holds you back, Joe, then from being like a full-on causal finitist?
Yeah, so one reason is just because a lot of the extant arguments for it I don't find like super convincing. So for mine, I have some reservations, just because some infinite causal chains are impossible. So this is even granting some of those principles. I myself, I don't know if I should accept all of these principles. Yeah, some of them do seem kind of intuitive, don't they? At least by my lights, they seem pretty intuitive. But should we expect our intuitions to be, our intuitions were cultivated and shaped by interaction with finite things around us. Should we expect our intuitions about infinity to be reliable? It's not at all clear.
Mhm.
So like that's one problem with appealing to like these kinds of intuitions that I do in this article. And also, like again, debarring, even if we grant some of these principles, like just because some infinite causal chains are impossible, that doesn't license you in inferring that all of them are impossible. Now, you might try to justify that by appeal to Patrick principles, but I have various reservations for Patrick principles and so on. I think they have lots of counterexamples, and we're applying them in domains very, very far removed from our ordinary experience, right? So we never in our ordinary experience are we using Patrick principles to patch together infinitely large worlds with infinite causal chains in them. No, the Patrick principle that we use in everyday modal reasoning is like, I've got a book here and it could be over there. Like those sorts of
Mhm.
like very humdrum, ordinary, very everyday grounded modal inferences. And those might be justified, even though the very far removed from our ordinary experience modal recombinations, maybe we don't have good reason to think that those are possible, precisely because they're so far removed from our ordinary experience. We just don't know what would be possible in such cases. So, like, I have reservations for each of the extant sort of arguments that people offer for causal finitism, including my own. And so, yeah, for a lot of the paradoxes that are cited, for instance, in Proust and Kuhn's and so on, I think that there are other simpler, potentially more powerful solutions or ways to kill the relevant paradoxes. So on my channel, I go through the unsatisfiable paradiagnosis, which, in my view, quite powerfully shows that a lot of these paradoxes, not the ones that I developed, but a lot of the Benedetti paradoxes, like Grim Reapers and so on, what's responsible for those paradoxes doesn't have anything to do with causation. Rather, it has to do with an abstract structure that they instantiate. And the abstract structure is basically, ultimately, like just saying P and not P. It's just harder to see. But that abstract structure shows you that, like, you can even generate non-causal versions of these paradoxes. Like, you can, and I go through this on my channel, my Kalam playlist. But, like, I think that tells us that it's not infinite causal chains that's doing the work, that's the culprit here. It's this abstract structure. So, like, that's for sort of certain Benedetti paradoxes, and I advise people to see my Kalam playlist for more on that, and I've got stuff under review. So that's one reason, right? That's one reason why I'm not a causal finitist, just because I have reservations for lots of the extant arguments for causal finitism, including my own. So that's one reason. A second reason is that lots of these arguments for causal finitism, so not only like reservations, but also like big problems for these arguments, is that a lot of them seem to entail that the future cannot be endless. But it seems to me that it's really plausible that the future could be endless. And for instance, Christianity entails that it is endless, and as does like Islam and so on. So like in Benedetti paradoxes, you could just imagine, so instead of each reaper doing something, if and only if no earlier reaper does something, with infinitely many earlier reapers, you can have each reaper doing something if and only if no future reaper does something. And if you have infinitely many of those reapers, each of which is instantiating that rule, well, then you get the exact same contradiction. You could just derive this. I can get out the little paper and pen and show you how you get the same contradiction from that. And then, of course, you might say, oh, well, how are these reapers sensitive to what's happening in the future, right? In the past, you can kind of see, right, in a mechanism as to how that could happen, right? Because it's in the past, right? Usually our dispositions are past sensitive. Like, I see something that happened in the past and I can act on that. How can you act on and know things that happen in the future? Well, that's where you bring in God, right? Defenders of these Benedetti paradoxes are almost universally theists, or at least traditionally. They're traditionally theists, and so they think God exists and knows the future. And so God can reveal to individual reapers whether or not some reaper in its future swings its scythe, let's say. So there are, and so if this could show that there can't be infinite causal chains past-oriented wise, or if there can't be infinite pasts, because if you could, then you'd be able to have this sort of paradox, well, then it would also show that you can't have infinite futures, which would entail that Christianity is false, which would, and it's also just really implausible, right? The future could be endless. That just seems really plausible. So that's another one of my reservations for a lot of these arguments, and I've also got some stuff under review on that. So yeah, the first main reason is reservations for the arguments. The second main reason is just like not merely reservations and like unclarities and so on, but like big problems that I think I see with the arguments. A third one is just that causal finitism is, shall we say, very metaphysically profligate. What that means is that it's really unsimple. It's a wide sweeping, unsimple thesis about the structure of reality. It's saying there cannot be infinite causal chains of any form whatsoever. And that rules out lots of ways that we might otherwise think that reality could be. And it rules out, arguably, it rules out infinite past. It rules out, it would arguably show that time is necessarily discrete rather than being able to be infinitely divided, right? Because suppose that time did have these kinds of infinite divisions already in it. Suppose that time weren't discrete. Suppose that there weren't smallest units of time. Well, then let me just drop this right now. I'm just going to drop a pen, if you could see this. Okay, I just dropped a pen. Now, its end state there is causally dependent on its various states throughout that process of me dropping it, right? Part of the explanation, the causal explanation for why the pen ended where it did at the very end is because, let's say, halfway through, it had such and such velocity, such and such laws of nature were operative, its state was such and such, it had such and such momentum, and so on. So, like, its state at each of these instants throughout the way is causally relevant to its state at the very end. They cause it at least indirectly. And so what that means is that in any ordinary causal process, you have an infinite causal chain in violation of causal finitism if time is not discrete. plausibly. And what that tells us is that, I mean, causal finitism is going to have to entail that time is discrete. It's like, whoa, that's a major implication. Like, lots of philosophers think that time not only, time could be continuous, right? I mean, because causal finitism says that these causal chains are impossible, it would show that time is necessarily discrete. So, like, a lot of philosophers think, like, not only is continuous space, or this infinitely divisible space, not only is that actually true, but I mean, it's at least possible, right? I mean, you might think that, but like, and some of our best scientific theories treat space, or treat time as if it's continuous, treat time as if it's infinitely divisible, and so, like, I don't know, man. It just has causal finitism. Just has so many of these sweeping implications for the structure of reality. And arguably, you're going to be able to, for precisely the same reasoning, you're going to have to show that space is necessarily discrete. So, like, there's a smallest unit of space, for the same sorts of reasons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like you start to realize all these massive implications of causal finitism about just the structure of reality, and not only that, the necessary structure of reality. And you start to be like, whoa, I did not sign up for that when I was just looking at these paradoxes. Like, and I mean, a lot of, like, there are lots of philosophers who think that time is not discrete and that space is not discrete. And still more philosophers who think that at least it could fail to be discrete, or it could, etc. But if causal finitism is true, then it couldn't fail to be discrete. It's necessarily discrete, etc. So it's like, and there are more of these implications. I'm just going through a few. So it's like, it's such an unsimple hypothesis. It's like, you think you're signing up to this innocuous claim, but like, it has these wide-reaching implications that are potentially even in conflict with, like, empirical science. I mean, like, again, some of our scientific theories that are exceptionally well confirmed treat time as if it's continuous, as if it's infinitely divisible, and so on. So it's just, you need to be hesitant if you're trying to adopt causal finitism, just because of how unsimple it is. All else being equal, we would prefer much simpler solutions to these various paradoxes if we can. So that's the third broad reason. I'd say the fourth broad reason is that, I don't know, like, a lot of these arguments just rely on applying either intuitions or applying modal principles far removed from our ordinary experience. Like, I don't know, our intuitions are cultivated by, again, like, our interactions with the finite world. And yet lots of these paradoxes of infinity and so on are trying to apply principles that we find intuitively obvious, or find intuitively plausible, to these, these far-reaching infinite domains that are so far removed from our ordinary experience. And it's like, it's difficult to see how you could be justified in doing that. Similarly, with lots of other principles, like Kuhn's uses an infinitary Patrick principle. And, when Kuhn's is introducing his argument, he's saying, oh yeah, well, we use Patrick principles in everyday reasoning. We use Patrick principles to be able to tell if I'm able to take this route, if it's blocked, or so on. It's like, okay, even if that's true, you can doubt that. But okay, set that aside. Even if that's true, we use a kind of humdrum everyday Patrick principle. We most certainly do not use an infinitary Patrick principle, where you can recombine infinitely many things in these infinitely many ways. It's like, I don't use that in my everyday reasoning, and I don't think anyone else does. So, and it's like, why should I think that principle? Why should I afford any confidence in the deliverances of that principle if it's so far removed from our ordinary experience, and it's concerning, like, these far out metaphysical possibilities? I mean, even the nature of metaphysical modality is steeped in unclarity and so on. So it's like, I don't know. It's like, I'm really hesitant with respect to these modal facts in domains that are super far removed from our ordinary humdrum experience, and I'm hesitant to apply principles that seem plausible, especially in finite cases, applying them to infinite cases. So that's maybe a fourth reason, is just, oh, and then I guess if you want to say, okay, Joe, like, if you can get around those worries, and you can say, well, no, we actually can apply these sorts of principles to domains removed far from ordinary experience. We can apply intuitions beyond them. So it's basically a dilemma. If we can't apply these principles in intuitions, or at least we're arguably unjustified in doing so, then a lot of these arguments for causal finitism fail. But if we can apply them, this side of the dilemma, well, then actually bunches of these modal epistemological tools actually count against causal finitism, right? I can conceive, conceivability. I can conceive of infinite causal chains. I can conceive of perfectly benign ones. like me just dropping this thing. I can conceive of space-time being continuous, with being infinitely divisible, and I can just drop this. I mean, that's perfectly well conceivable, and so an infinite causal chain is perfectly conceivable. And if conceivability gives us defeasible evidence for possibility, then I have some weight of a reason to think that infinite causal chains are possible. Contra causal finitism. Same with imaginability, right? I can imagine these sorts of things, and that's a modal epistemological tool, and I'm applying it in domains far removed from our ordinary experience, but still. Again, we're on that horn of the dilemma where we're justified in doing that. Modal uniformity or continuity. Some of your listeners might be familiar with Josh Rasmussen and some of his work. But Josh Rasmussen basically has a principle of modal uniformity or continuity. And it basically says that if y is possible, and if y differs merely in quantity from x, then we have defeasible reason to think that x is also possible. To me, that seems prima facie plausible, right? We shouldn't posit violations in otherwise uniform quantitative classes unless we have positive reasons for thinking otherwise. And if we apply this to infinite causal chains, well, I mean, hey, we have really good reason to think that any finitely long causal chain is possible. And given that infinitely long causal chains differs from such finite chains merely quantitatively, and given that the latter are uniformly possible, per Josh's own principle, we have defeasible reason to think that infinite causal chains are likewise possible. Similarly with modal recombination, right? Remember, I appeal to a recombination principle in arguing for causal finitism, and some other authors do as well. But actually, boatloads of recombination principles deliver the possibility of an infinite past and infinite causal chains. So David Lewis's principle allows this. Daniel Nolan's Patrick principle allows this. But basically, you can just patch together space-time regions themselves, right? So we know that space-time regions are individually possible. Let's say a space-time region containing this desk and this hour, right, that we've been here. Well, if I can duplicate space-time regions and duplicate the contents of space-time regions and rearrange them in various ways, well, then I should be able to take this one that I know is actually possible because it's actual, and I should be able to duplicate it infinitely often. And what that shows is that you could have an infinite past because you can just duplicate this space-time region infinitely often into an infinite past. We know that it's actual, and we know that we can do these duplications and recombinations and so on. And I just don't see any relevant difference between patching together space-time regions themselves from, let's say, patching together contents of space-time regions. But anyway. So, like, a lot of these modal principles count against causal finitism, the very ones that are used in these sorts of arguments for causal finitism. And then here's a fifth reason. I think I have 6 reasons in here. Yes, okay, so here's my 5th reason why I am not a causal finitist, and at least why I'm agnostic. And it's basically a new companions in guilt argument against causal finitism. So I actually sent this argument to Proust, and he said that it's, quote, a pretty powerful argument. So I posted on social media, and I also posted on my YouTube channel that Proust said this. And he also said some kind things about my work more generally, which I was very, very grateful for. But people were asking, like, Joe, what was the argument? What was the argument? And before I get to the argument, for the to tease the audience, my battery's at 4% right now, so I'm going to go up. I'm going to be back in 2 seconds. If you could plug your channel or plug my channel or something for like 30 seconds while I go grab it, that would be appreciated.
Yeah, right on, man. So I will plug channels, and thank you, Joe, for telling me something to do here because I don't get like put on the spot. But yeah, Joe's channel is at the Majesty of Reason. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you can literally just click it right there, add it, boom, done, following Joe. And if you are listening via podcast, it should be added as well. And yeah, and obviously this channel is a Apologetics. If you're new here, I always encourage you to subscribe, leave a like, and all that fun stuff. So yeah, I encourage people to check out both our channels. Joe's channel does a lot of like philosophy, looking at things like classical theism and other models of God, and looks at like especially like Thomistic arguments and things like that. My channel just explores a bunch of different things in Christian like philosophy, theology, apologetics, stuff like that. And yeah, if those things interest you, I encourage you to subscribe to both our channels. And yeah, there's a lot of great content on both channels. And I think Joe is back or not.
Okay. Okay, I am back. Let's see. Start the camera up. Whoops, I clicked stop camera. There we go.
There you go.
Okay, I saved it just in time. Sorry, I was a little bit worried. That's been on my mind for the past like 5 minutes or so, or like 10 minutes. It's been slowly going down from like 6% to 5% to 4%. I'm like, I was like, I'm sorry, I need to stop this. I've been a little bit distracted, but okay. Back to the Proust argument, right? So I sent this argument to Proust. And so it's basically a companions and guilt argument against causal finitism. I don't know whether or not it ultimately succeeds. I just find it, somewhat plausible. And again, Proust said it was, quote, a pretty powerful argument. So that's kind of cool. But so this doesn't, of course, mean that Proust ultimately agrees with it, right? But it means something. Okay. So again, recall that causal finitism is the thesis that necessarily nothing causally depends on infinitely many things. We can also articulate a closely related thesis called dependence finitism. Now, according to dependence finitism, nothing depends on infinitely many things. Notice the close similarity between those two, right? Causal finitism is that necessarily nothing causally depends on infinitely many things, whereas dependence finitism is that necessarily nothing depends on infinitely many things, right? So there's literally one word difference between these theses. One of them just adds in causal to the dependence, right? It's nothing causally depends on infinitely many things, whereas the other one says nothing depends on infinitely many things. Okay, so here's the argument, and then I'm just going to go through the plausibility of some of the premises. So this is a companions and guilt argument against causal finitism. Premise 1, if causal finitism is true, then dependence finitism is true. Premise 2, but dependence finitism is false. Conclusion, it follows that causal finitism is false. That doesn't mean that there are infinite causal chains, by the way. It just means that there could be. Okay, remember, causal finitism is a thesis about necessity, right? It's necessarily nothing can causally depend on infinitely many things. Okay, so premise 2, why should we think that? Well, remember premise 2, it says that dependence finitism is false. Well, again, I'm just going to kind of do a strict technical sense of ad hominem argument here. Ad hominem, usually in like the sort of colloquial contexts, we think of an ad hominem as like, you suck, therefore your argument it fails, or like, you suck, therefore you're wrong, or something like that. But as there's a technical notion of ad hominem that philosophers use, and the technical notion is that like you're showing that someone else's views have an internal problem with them. So like for theists, you might say like, okay, I'm not, someone might say, I'm not a theist, so this isn't like a problem for me, but it's an ad hominem in the sense that this is a problem for those who hold to theism, So that's sort of what I'm doing. I'm doing a kind of ad hominem procedure for theist proponents of causal finitism, right? So people like Proust and Kuhns and so on. Okay, so I think that such theist proponents should think that premise 2 is true. That is, they should think that dependence finitism is false, because that's what premise 2 says. Okay, why? Well, here are some reasons. First, there are infinitely many truths, right? 1 plus 1 equals 2, 1 plus 2 equals 3, 1 plus 3 equals 4, and so on. Those are all true. I'm distinct from the number 1, I'm distinct from the number 2, I'm distinct from the number 3, and so on. Right? We could be here all day. So there are infinitely many truths, but knowledge that P depends on its being the case that P, right? You can't know something unless it's actually true, unless it's actually the case, right? So knowledge in some sense depends on the fact. No, this is widely held in epistemology, and it's very widely held. Knowledge that P depends on P's being true. In fact, I don't know anyone in epistemology who denies this. Okay, so knowledge that P depends on P. And so what that means is that because there are infinitely many truths, and God knows all the truths since he's omniscient, right? And knowledge that P depends on P, we've got God's omniscience depending on infinitely many truths. And that's in violation of dependence finitism, right? So similarly, if the future is endless, right? God's knowledge of what happens on each day of the endless future depends on what happens on each day of the endless future, right? Like God knows that this will happen tomorrow, that such and such will happen the next day, that such and such will happen the next day, and so on ad infinitum into an endless future. And so God's knowledge, again, is going to be depending on infinitely many facts here. The fact about what happens tomorrow, the fact about what happens after the day tomorrow, the fact that what happens after that day, and so on ad infinitum. So again, we've got God's current knowledge depending on infinitely many facts about what's going to happen in the future. Furthermore, right, God has infinitely many ideas, right? He's got ideas about numbers, ideas about abstracta, ideas about possibilities that he could have created, and so on. So God's knowledge of his own ideas, right? God obviously knows his own ideas. What are you going to say? God's ignorant of his own ideas? That's ludicrous. So God knows his own ideas, and there are infinitely many such ideas. So God's knowledge of his ideas depends on infinitely many ideas. And again, that's in violation of causal finitism. You have God's knowledge, or God's, let's say, state of awareness, that's dependent on infinitely many different things, namely his ideas. So again, if you're a theist, I think you should really accept premise 2. Dependence finitism is false. Proust also gives arguments in his 2018 book based on reasons. So plausibly, since God is omni-rational, he's perfectly rational and etc. Because he's omni-rational, he acts on the basis of any and all reasons that there are. Okay, but there are infinitely many reasons favoring the actualization of our world, right? I mean, take any particular good that occurs. The fact that that good occurs is some reason to create our world, to actualize our world, because it's a good thing, right? Good things give God reason to actualize our world. But, if the future is endless, there are going to be infinitely many good things that obtain in the course of the history as in the whole timeline of our world. And so God has infinitely many reasons to create our world, right? Because each of those individual goods, and there are infinitely many of them, is itself a reason to create our world. And so God's choice to actualize this world depends on his taking infinitely many of these things as reasons. So we have infinitely many reasons supporting or undergirding a single choice of God's, right? So we have one thing, God's choice, depending on infinitely many things, the different reasons that there are. Now, what Proust says in his book is he just says, yeah, like that's true, but this is not causal dependence. So he says, okay, that's fine, right? It's not a violation of causal finitism. So Proust agrees, it seems, with me that dependence finitism is false, and I think you should too, you as in the audience.
Mhm.
So if you're a theist. And then finally, a final reason to think that dependence finitism is false is that, plausibly, a lot of philosophers think that mathematical realism is true, so that there are numbers, let's say, and also set theoretic realism is true, like there are sets, right? It's difficult to go without sets in your ontology. But if there are sets and if there are numbers, well, then plausibly there's a set containing the natural numbers. But sets depend on their elements, right? It's not as though I depend on the set containing me, right? This abstract object, which is the set containing me. No, that set exists precisely because I exist, right? Sets are dependent on their members. Members are more fundamental than the sets that they're members of. And what that means is that if we have a set of the natural numbers, as per mathematical and set theoretic realism, well, then we have one thing, that set, depending on infinitely many things, right? The different numbers, and there are infinitely many such numbers. So, again, there's really good reason to think that mathematical realism is true, that set theoretic realism is true, and so on. And these entail a violation of dependence finitism. Okay, so premise 2 seems plausible. It seems plausible that dependence finitism is false, especially if it's cast in these kind of ad hominem terms for like, hey, you theists should think that this premise is false. But what then about premise 1? If causal finitism is true, then dependence finitism is also true. Well, the idea is that intuitively, there's no relevant difference between causal finitism and dependence finitism that could account for why one, but not the other, is true, right? Alternatively, if causal finitism is true, it's plausibly true in virtue of, let's say, the nature of the causal relation, right? For example, it might be that infinite causal dependence is a kind of vicious dependence. But plausibly, dependence more generally shares these objectionable features in infinite cases, right? If causal dependence is vicious, well, then plausibly just explanatory dependence more generally, where one thing is depending on infinitely many things, that's likewise vicious. There just doesn't seem to be any relevant difference between the two. It would seem arbitrary to say that one of these is perfectly possible while the other one isn't, despite the fact that they're so similar to one another. Again, causal dependence is just a kind of dependence. And so what undergirds this premise even further is that, causation and dependence more generally plausibly have the same formal properties or the same formal features. So they're both asymmetric, right? So if A causes B, then it's not the case that B causes A. And similarly, if A depends on B, it's not the case that B depends on A. They're also irreflexive, right? It's not the case that A causes A, right? Nothing can cause itself. And similarly, it's not the case that A is explanatorily dependent on A, right? A can't be grounded in itself or like somehow dependent on itself. It'd be pulling itself up by its own bootstraps. It's for the same reasons that people say you can't have self-causation, you also can't have self-dependence. Self-causation, something would need to exist in some sense explanatorily prior to itself in order to even bring itself about in the first place. So it'd be both prior and posterior to itself. But the same thing is true of this explanatory dependence. And moreover, they're both transitive, right? If A causes B and B causes C, then A causes C. So like if I cause this water bottle to knock over and that water bottle's knocking over, causes water to spill on the floor, well then I still caused the water bottle on the floor. You can blame me for that, right? I was causally responsible for that. Maybe indirectly, but I'm still causally responsible for it. Similarly, dependence is transitive. So if the structure of the water molecules depends on certain chemical facts, about sharing of electrons, and those chemical facts depend on more fundamental physical facts, let's say like a Pauli exclusion principle or something, well then the water molecule facts depend on those physical facts, right? So transitivity applies in both cases. So it's like they have the same formal features, and in that case, it seems exceedingly difficult to draw a wedge between causal finitism and dependence finitism, such that only one of them could be false while the other one is true. Or alternatively, it's very difficult, it seems, to draw a wedge between infinite causal dependence chains and infinite dependence chains, which is such that it could justify you in saying that one of them is possible while the other one is just somehow impossible. So again, like none of these like strictly entail like, you'd be irrational if you don't accept premise one. I'm not saying that, right? So none of them strictly entail that. But I don't know, they seem pretty plausible. And Proust also thinks that they seem pretty powerful. So it's a companions and guilt style argument against causal finitism. I might try to write it up into a paper, maybe. I've just got so much on my plate. So anyway, I think that's a fifth reason, and then a sixth reason, which I'll be very short here because I know we're coming to the end of our time. The sixth problem is that, well, hey, I mean, we might think, like, listen, a lot of people say an infinite past is really counterintuitive. Like, it's just weird. But a finite past is so weird as well. I mean, I don't know, think about it. Like, it's so weird. Like, if the past is finite, I mean, arguably, right? If the past is finite, well, then, something plausibly brought the past into existence, plausibly. But that thing could in itself be in the past. It couldn't itself be in time because it's supposed to be what's responsible for time, right? So you'd have to have some sort of timeless to temporal causation, something like timelessly causing something that's like, how do you get a temporal effect from a timeless cause? I mean, that's not really an argument, but it is an intuition. I mean, a lot of people do share this intuition that, like, how could you have timeless to temporal causation, like something timeless, somehow bringing about a temporal effect? A lot of people think that that's just extremely counterintuitive, but it's also inductively implausible, right? I mean, inductively speaking, all the causes in our experience are temporal to temporal causes, and that gives us some weight of a reason to think that all causes are temporal to temporal causes. Just as the fact that we see in our experience that every beginning has a cause gives us some weight of a reason to think that every beginning whatsoever has a cause. So, yeah, I mean, and there are more problems that you could point out for a finite past. It's just, people ignore the counterintuitive nature of a finite past by focusing on the counterintuitive nature of an infinite past by their lights. But like, you turn the tables and it's still like, you get lots of implausibilities. It's like, man, there's like a timeless cause of this, and it's like, did that timeless thing somehow become temporal? How is that not like a change? And if it was a change, how is it not the case that it used to exist in timelessly? But that doesn't make any sense, right? You can't used to exist timelessly, because that's like saying that the timeless thing stands in temporal relation to other things. The timeless thing would be in the past. So then does it like always exist timelessly? But then that seems really weird. Then you'd have like a timeless God or somehow some other timeless object, which is continually sustaining a changing creation. If presentism is true, that gets you into a lot of big trouble. So like, finite path is difficult, man. It's very difficult. I mean, so is an infinite path, but both of them are difficult. I mean, we're at the edge of human thought. Something weird is happening. But if someone wants to rely on intuition to rule out infinite paths, well, then arguably they should rely on intuition in this case as well. And if there are these intuitive problems for a finite path, that might justify us in thinking that, hey, the past couldn't be finite. And if the past couldn't be finite, then plausibly it's infinite. If the past is infinite, well, then arguably you get a denial of causal finitism from that, because the past is infinite. If you think that causation provides time with its directionality and unity, such that what unifies something into one timeline is a kind of continuous flow of causation and continuous causal links, what that means is that you would have an infinite causal chain in an infinite past. So if you think that there are problems for a finite past, and that if you think that there are such problems, that can motivate you in thinking that the past is infinite, or at the very least that it could be infinite. And if it could be infinite, then it could be the case, plausibly, that there can be infinite causal chains, which is a violation of causal finitism. So again, none of these, again, I'm not giving anything that's like strictly entailing causal finitism's falsehood or these other sorts of things. I guess my point is just like, there are some reasons that people can have that aren't implausible to think that causal finitism might not be true. And yeah, and like I said, I'm agnostic on these sorts of things because I do think that there's an interesting case to be made from causal finitism. It does have explanatory power in killing a number of different paradoxes in disparate domains. So that is something going for it, right? There are other ways to kill lots of these paradoxes, but I mean, causal finitism does give you a unified solution to them, and that's desirable, right? You want a unifying solution that can unify these disparate host of domains and so on. And it seems to be explanatorily powerful as well. So as you can see, I'm agnostic on the matter. And I think a lot of people in these sorts of domains suffer from a little bit too much confidence, either in the truth or falsity of causal finitism. And I just think there are considerations on both sides, people. And the lay of the land of reasons is vaster than you might think.
Well, I appreciate your humility on the topic, Joe, and I like how you're trying to show, like, hey, there's really good reasons to think it might be true, and there's really good reasons to think they might be false. And it's like, it's a complex issue. We're not going to like come home and watch this hour and 15-minute video and boom, you're done. Answer solved. The rest of your life,
Yeah.
you're done. So, Joe, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate it. Any like last thoughts or things you want to say before we wrap up here?
Well, thank you for having me on. I wanted to say that. I guess I'm sorry we got into, like, I don't know, it was so difficult to explain some of these concepts. Like, this has probably been one of the most challenging interviews that I've had, just because it's, I don't know, it's really difficult to explain what's going on in my paper there, just because there's a lot of math going on. There's a lot of exponents and different processes, different terms like systems, processes, steps, a bunch of different principles at play, a lot of different concepts involved, like underdetermination and causation, time, the structure of time, the topology of time. Like, it's very difficult. So this, I mean, this is one of the most difficult. This is one of the reasons why I've shied away from talking about this article on my channel and so on, just because I found it very difficult to talk about it in a way that's in a way that you don't need to like have a lot of philosophy training to understand. So I tried for the audience. I tried. So, but I'm sorry if at times it was difficult to understand. But anyway, I hope it served all of y'all.
Yeah, I mean, I think a good analogy for this is like, I just hope we can find something out of this. Like, I've been reading Martin Luther's Bondage of the Man, or Free Will, or something like that. It's like just basically like free will sucks, guys. Come on, get out of here. And for me, there's a lot of points where I'm like, what is he talking about? But every once in a while, like I get a little nugget. I'm like, okay, that makes sense, and okay, that makes sense. So even if it like for you, if you like listen to this and you're like confused, hopefully you found a little bit of nuggets here and there that can help you make sense with your journey. And yeah, Joe, I think you did a great job. And obviously, it's a super technical paper, so I think you crushed it. So thank you so much. And I already did all the nice talking of saying go follow Joe and when you were charging your computer. So
well, thank you.
That's it, guys. Thank you, Joe, so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Have a good one, and God bless. We'll see you next time.